the call stack. As we have seen, every function being called has a frame inside the stack. This frame is just an idea. The processor doesn't know about any frame. The frame contains the arguments, the return address, the old EBP, and then the local variables. Maybe in some other words, the stack tells the story of all functions currently open, all the way to the current function. Let's look at an example. Assume that our code began from the start label somehow, pretty much as usual. Now assume that start calls some function, which is called func_a, and assume that currently we are inside func_a. At this point, we should have this picture on the stack. We have EBP pointing to old EBP, and we have the arguments somewhere here, and the locals somewhere here. We could access both the arguments and the locals using EBP plus or minus some number. ESP points to the last local, somewhere here. It depends, you can actually call this the first local if you want. But it really points here. Now assume that in the middle of func_a, a new function is being called. A new function is being called from the code inside func_a. Let's call it func_b. Now we get this picture inside the stack. We have another frame. And currently EBP points here, and ESP points here, to the last of the locals. Usually this part is going to be referred to as func_a's frame, and this part is called func_b's frame. Another interesting point is that old EBP, the contents of this dword on the stack, is the address of this location. Or maybe if you want, in some assembly syntax, if we take EBP and read the dword at location EBP in memory, this dword is going to be the address of this location. How can we explain it? Remember that during func_a, before we invoked func_b, EBP pointed here. Therefore, old EBP is really the address of this location. This is a bit of an interesting idea, and I recommend you to think about it yourself a bit. Traversing the call stack. Basically, we've just seen that the EBP entries form some kind of a linked list. A linked list is a list where every element has some pointer or some address which corresponds to the next element. And we can traverse this list by following those addresses. If we extend the picture and we consider more functions, we are going to have something like this. This is a really generalized picture of the stack. We omitted many parts. For example, we don't write here about the arguments and the locals. What we get is that if we begin from some EBP in the middle of some function, maybe for example we are in the middle of func_d, and we observe the value of EBP, we will get the following. EBP points to a location in memory inside the stack which contains the old EBP. and this value points here. We can continue this procedure to traverse the stack backwards to the first function that was called. Maybe if you want to see it in some assembly syntax, this is how it looks like. If we use this instruction, we will get this new location. And if we use this instruction again, move EBP, dword EBP, we are going to get to this new location, and so on. This is basically just an idea to emphasize what the stack looks like. You are probably not going to do this in your code because usually there is no reason to do this. Maybe if you want to get a picture of the contents of the stack, then you might do this, but usually there is no reason to run this kind of code. Usually you will not touch EBP besides the prologue and the epilogue of the function. The enter and leave instructions. Almost all functions begin and end in the same standard way. Those standard beginning and ending are also called prologue and epilogue. So far we have seen those kinds of prologues and epilogues. If we have a function, we first push EBP, then move ESP into EBP, and then we allocate some space for local variables. Finally, we have the function's body, where we actually do some work after all this prologue, and eventually we have the epilogue, which clears stuff up before we exit from the program. We first free some space from the stack because we took some space for ourselves here. Then we pop EBP, and finally we return. This construct is so common that new instructions were introduced to do this job. And probably by the title you have already guessed that those instructions are enter and leave. Let's see how we build a stack frame using enter and leave. We begin with the usual prologue and epilogue with the function that we've just seen called func. First we take those three instructions and we exchange them by this one instruction, enter n0, which does exactly this. Those three instructions are equivalent to this one instruction. Next we want to deal with the epilogue or the ending of the function. Instead of this instruction, add ESP-n, we are going to use a bit of a different instruction. Move ESP EBP. I want to explain why those two instructions, which are not equivalent, have the same effect here. This instruction, add ESP-n, is supposed to balance the stack. After we've acquired n bytes, we want to free those n bytes by adding n to ESP. We could do it in a different way. Recall that EBP contains the original value of ESP. So instead of adding n to ESP, we could just move EBP into ESP and get exactly the same effect. I want to emphasize that those two instructions are not the same. It just gives us the same effect. There are some strange cases where using one instruction will give you different results from another instruction. For example, if you failed to balance the stack in the code in the middle, maybe for example if you just pushed some number to the stack and forgot to pop it, then those two instructions are going to have different effects. But we are not going to get into this right now. So we begin with this modification. Next we are going to use the leave instruction. The leave instruction is exactly equivalent to this part. Some interesting thing about this new kind of epilogue, even before talking about live, is that the epilogue doesn't have to know the size of n. And this is pretty interesting. It gives us some kind of independence because the epilogue does not depend on n, which is defined on the prologue. We don't have to sync the prologue and the epilogue. We can just have the same epilogue for many different prologues. And this is the main advantage of using this form, move ESP EBP, over the original instruction, add ESP n. And as we said, those two instructions are exactly equivalent to this one instruction, called live. You have to admit that the code on the right side is much cleaner. Let's talk about enter and live in a more detailed fashion. Enter has the following signature. It looks like this. It has two arguments. The first one is called size, and the next one is called nesting level. We are not really going to talk about the second argument because it is really never used. I think that I've never seen a use of this second argument. So we will just set it to 0 whenever we use the enter instruction. This instruction is also known as make stack frame for procedure parameters. It has the following operation, and I remind you that you have to set nesting level to 0. It is exactly equivalent to those three instructions. Push EBP, move ESP into EBP, and finally subtract n from ESP. Those three instructions are exactly equivalent to this instruction, enter n 0. The live instruction has no arguments. It is also known as high-level procedure exit, and it has the following operation. It is exactly equivalent to those two instructions. Move EBP into ESP, and then pop EBP. I want to emphasize that this instruction is not going to do the ret for you. You have to add ret yourself. Let me show you again. In this example, we did have the ret instruction. Live is not going to do this for you. Some frequently asked questions. Do I have to use EBP for stack-based argument passing? Maybe, for example, I don't like EBP. Do I have to use it? The answer is no. You don't have to do anything. This is your code. You do whatever you like inside your programs and your code. However, I do recommend to use the EBP method and all the idea of the stack frame. It is a very good practice to do it because it will help you in the future. It will, for example, help you if you want to debug your program. There is a program called Debugger which uses the stack frames to traverse the stack and to give you useful information about your program. And then if something goes wrong, you can understand better what happened. Another important reason to use the EBP-based stack frame is that other people could read your code easily. It will make your code much more readable. If you use some arbitrary method for accessing the arguments, it will be very hard to other people to follow your code. Next question. Which way should I choose to write my function prologue and epilogue? Should I use enter and live? Or maybe push EBP, move EBP, ESP, and so on? The answer again is that it's your code and you decide. If you like enter and live, you can use enter and live. If you like the other way, or maybe you want to tweak things a little bit, then maybe the other way is better for you. Maybe you should use the push EBP, move EBP, ESP. I want to give you some other information about this subject. Enter does take less bytes in memory. However, some people say that it is slower. Currently in 2014, probably enter is a bit slower than using push EBP, move EBP, ESP. I didn't see many compilers that produce code with the enter instruction. Almost every compiler these days produces code of the form push EBP, move EBP, ESP, and so on. However, I did see that the leave instruction is being used, even by very good compilers. So if you want, you can even mix those two. You could, for example, use the push EBP, move EBP, ESP, and then sub ESP some number, and in the end of the function use leave. This is what many compilers do, so it might be the best choice with respect to speed or efficiency, for example. At this point, however, I don't really think that you should care about efficiency or speed. So just pick whatever is more comfortable to you. Enter and leave are really short, so you might want to just have enter in the beginning of your function and leave in the end. Summary of this lesson. We have seen that we can use EBP to hold the stack frame. EBP contains the initial value of ESP, and then we don't care if ESP changes. We just rely on EBP to refer to all the arguments and the local data. We make space for local variables on the stack by simply decreasing ESP. In the end of the function, we free that space by increasing ESP by exactly the same number. We've seen that if we use EBP and the usual way to create stack frames and to destroy stack frames, we get that the stack is divided into different frames of different functions. The EBPs on the stack form some kind of a linked list that can be traversed. Finally, we've seen the enter and leave instructions, which allow us to build and destroy the stack frame, maybe in a cleaner syntax somehow. Exercises. There are some really interesting exercises this time. As usual, they are about reading code and writing code. Enjoy and see you next time.